Most gardeners lose the pest battle the moment they separate herbs from the system they're supposed to protect. They plant basil in one corner, rosemary in another, spray when insects show up, and then wonder why aphids, whiteflies, and caterpillars keep cycling back stronger every season. That mistake costs flavor, yield, and time, and it quietly trains pests to treat your garden like a reliable food source instead of a hostile environment. Before we get into the method, if you care about growing herbs that actually survive pressure without constant spraying, subscribe to the Farm Logic channel. This channel is about systems that hold up in real gardens, not tricks that only work once. Why old monastery gardens stayed productive without chemicals. Monastic herb gardens weren't decorative. They were pharmacies, kitchens, and preservation centers. Crop loss wasn't an inconvenience, it was a real problem. What's interesting is that records and layouts from these gardens show something most modern growers ignore. Herbs were not grown as isolated plants. They were grown in dense, layered clusters with deliberate spacing, shared root zones, and controlled stress. I tested this approach first out of frustration. My raised bed herbs looked healthy but were constantly under attack, especially tender growth like basil, dill, and parsley. Sprays worked briefly. Companion planting helped a little. What finally worked was copying the structure, not the plant list. You know, the real trick isn't the herbs themselves, it's actually how they're grown together. Most pest advice tends to focus on plant chemistry, right? The idea is that strong-smelling herbs will repel insects, supposedly. But in practice, pests adapt rather quickly. What they don't adapt to easily is a root zone that never behaves predictably. In those old monastery-style beds, herbs were grown close enough that their roots interacted constantly, but not so close that airflow stopped. In my own beds, I reduced spacing by about a third compared to standard recommendations. For example, basil that normally gets planted 30 centimeters apart went in at around 20. Thyme and oregano filled the gaps instead of being isolated at the edges. This approach creates low-level competition. Plants under mild, constant competition actually produce more defensive compounds. That's not just theory. You can really smell the difference when you brush the leaves. Stronger oils mean tougher feeding for insects. So, why does uniform watering make pest problems worse? Well, one of the biggest modern mistakes is treating herbs like pampered houseplants. Constant moisture, rich soil, and zero stress produce lush growth that pests absolutely love. Old monastery gardens didn't water for appearance, you know. They watered just enough to keep plants alive, not comfortable. In my raised beds, I stopped deep watering on a schedule and started watering based on leaf behavior. Herbs like rosemary, sage, and thyme were allowed to dry almost to the point of stress before watering. Basil and parsley still got more moisture, but, you know, never saturated soil. That uneven moisture pattern confuses soil-dwelling pests and reduces fungal pressure. It also forces herbs to thicken cell walls, making leaf tissue, well, harder to chew. How I build a pest-resistant herb bed from scratch. In a small backyard garden, I start with a bed no wider than 1.2 meters, so I can reach everything without stepping in. I mix in compost at about 20% by volume, not more. Richer soil produces weaker herbs. I don't add nitrogen-heavy amendments. I plant woody herbs like rosemary, sage, and lavender first, spacing them loosely but, you know, forming a rough backbone. Around them, I plant softer herbs like basil, cilantro, and dill a bit tighter than usual. Ground-level herbs like thyme and marjoram fill open soil so pests have, well, fewer landing zones. Mulch is thin. Thick mulch creates hiding places for insects. I use just enough to prevent soil crusting, often coarse sand or fine gravel around Mediterranean herbs. So what actually happens to pests in this system? Well, aphids still appear, and caterpillars still show up occasionally. The difference is they don't explode in numbers. Predatory insects move in faster because the plant diversity gives them plenty of cover. More importantly, pest reproduction drops because stressed aromatic plants are, poor hosts. In my third season using this layout, I stopped spraying entirely. Damage never reached economic levels. Sure, leaves had the occasional bite, but harvest quality actually improved because the oil concentration increased. Why are foliar sprays mostly a distraction? Well, people love sprays because they feel like action, don't they? But in my experience, sprays only matter if the underlying system already discourages pests. Otherwise, you're just delaying the next wave. I've tested neem, soap, fermented herb teas and mineral sprays. They help temporarily but don't replace structure. Once the bed itself became hostile, sprays became optional tools instead of necessities. Applying this method to containers and raised beds. Well, in containers, the same principle applies, but water management matters more. I use wider containers rather than deep ones and plant mixed herbs together instead of one species per pot. A 40-centimetre wide container can comfortably hold basil, parsley and thyme if watered carefully. Raised beds work best when you resist the urge to over-amend. Herbs grown too rich become magnets for pests. Slightly lean soil produces tougher plants. Now, how does all this translate to hydroponic herb systems, you might wonder? Well, hydroponics can be a bit tricky because, you see, you're removing soil biology from the equation. Still, the principle of controlled stress absolutely applies here. In NFT and DWC systems, I tend to lower nitrogen just a touch below what's typically recommended for herbs, and I allow the EC to fluctuate within a safe range, rather than keeping it absolutely stable all the time. I also like to mix herb species in the same system, instead of dedicating channels to just one plant. For example, basil grown alongside rosemary in hydroponics will often develop thicker leaves and, interestingly, you'll see far fewer pest issues, even when growing indoors. There are, of course, some trade-offs that gardeners need to accept with this approach. This system isn't going to produce picture-perfect herbs overnight, I'm afraid. Growth can be a bit slower at first, and the leaves might be a little smaller. But honestly, the flavour is stronger, the shelf life is longer, and pest pressure drops dramatically over time. So it's a bit of a give and take, really. If your goal is fast turnover for market aesthetics, this may not be ideal. But if your goal is resilient, low-input herb production, it's hard to beat. Why does this old method still matter now? Well, monastery gardeners didn't fight pests head-on. Instead, they designed environments pests didn't enjoy. Honestly, that mindset is more useful than any product on the shelf. After multiple seasons using this approach, I found it scales well, adapts to different climates and, really rewards attention rather than constant intervention. If growing better food with fewer inputs matters to you, just subscribe to the Farm Logic channel and share this video with someone who's tired of chasing pest problems instead of solving them. The best gardens don't rely on control. They rely on balance built into the system.